We are wanting to thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Allison Arnold, and I am the Agriculture Extension Agent for Buncombe County for Consumer Horticulture here in Buncombe County. And I'll be your host today. I'd like to welcome you to Learning Garden Presents Saturday seminar, Keep Your Vegetable Garden Growing into Fall. Alan Wagner is our speaker this morning. He is been a master gardener for about 14 years and is presently the co-leader of the vegetable garden in the Learning Garden here in Buncombe County Extension Center at Mount Carmel Road in Asheville, North Carolina. Alan has gardened in Missouri and Indiana, Virginia, California, and now in North Carolina, and he'll be sharing his enthusiasm and also his vast experience in vegetable gardening. Alan will talk about ways to plant a fall garden and extend your growing season into the fall and winter, and discuss cool weather vegetables to plant and when to plant them, and tips for extending the gardening season using cold frame hoops and row covers. So Alan, take it away.
Keep your vegetable garden growing into the fall. Many of the same garden strategies that apply to spring and summer gardening will also be useful for fall gardening. You have to prepare your beds, loosen the soil and amend it. Pay attention to watering and weeding, and watch for plant pests. However, there are major differences. Spring gardens are warming up, while fall gardens are cooling off. Seeds and seedlings can expect improving conditions in the spring with more hours of sunlight and frequent spring rains. Fall gardens will grow slower as the weather cools and hours of sunlight decrease and sun angle lowers. Plants must be mature or nearly so before the first frost, unless they're very cold hardy. Fall is usually drier, so attention to watering is especially important. Garden is not made for singing, "Oh, how beautiful," and sitting in the shade. I like to use this slide to remind people that gardening, even a few small beds, is a fair amount of work. Singing is fine, but it doesn't grow vegetables. So what are we going to try and cover today? Here's your course objectives, and I'll say just a little bit about that. Where will your garden be? In rows, in raised beds, or in a few containers on your deck? What tricks are there for keeping frost off of your crops and keeping them warm enough to grow? How early do you have to get started with the fall garden planting regimen? What can you plant that's likely to succeed in the fall garden? Do you plant seeds or transplants, or simply cut back certain summer crops that sprout again for the fall? What are cover crops, and which ones are appropriate for a fall garden? Here's 3 different types of gardens that you might be exposed to or know about. The one in the upper right, these are large commercial gardens in long rows. Down below, you have typical raised beds, and on the side here, containers. For the home gardener, most fall gardens will consist of a few short rows of raised beds and maybe some containers. Rows and beds. You can plant fall crops in either, but it's probably easier to protect them if they're planted in a bed. And the reason for that is you can put more plants in the same amount of space, and you have a frame that you can use for attaching potential covers. No matter when or how you're growing a garden, it's always a good idea to start with a soil test. This will tell you what condition your soil is in. North Carolina charges $4 per test from December to March. The other months are free. The only expense to you is mailing soil test boxes to North Carolina State University for testing. You can get test boxes and information on how to take a test from Extension Service. The test results come back to you online, and you can call the Master Gardener hotline. In Buncombe County, that's 255-5522. And I'll repeat that once more, 255-5522, if you need assistance in interpreting the results. As indicated on the slide, in August, the turnaround time is only about a week. But if you wait until fall, when all of the farmers are testing their soil, you will wait considerably longer. That covers our first section on where to plant. Now we're moving on to season extenders. This section deals with how to extend the garden into the fall. And you're probably wondering about this slide, Archaeology and Gardening, and wondering what the heck has archaeology got to do with modern gardening? Actually, quite a bit. Archaeologists have discovered that for thousands of years, early farming cultures used thermal walls, rocks placed around plants, and planting crops close to the bodies of water to extend the growing season and to create earlier starts for some plants. In the mountains of Peru, archaeologists were long baffled by ancient fields that were clearly too high for what they assumed were irrigation ditches that surrounded the fields. Then one archaeologist noticed that some modern farmers were doing the same thing. When asked why they did this, the farmer replied, "The water in the ditches keeps the frost away." Water heated up by the sun during the day cools slowly at night, providing heating to the surrounding crops and literally kept the frost away. Thermal collectors, bricks, concrete blocks, rocks or rock walls, jugs of water, or small ponds. Anything you can use to collect heat during the day and allow it to slowly radiate during the night is a thermal collector. If the thermal collector is incorporated into a row cover or mini greenhouses, it works even better. Try a few bricks between plants in a cold frame. Feel how warm they get on a sunny day. The thermal collectors increase the nighttime temperature inside a cold frame or hoop tent to reduce or prevent frost damage. That's thermal collectors. Temperatures definitely affect productivity. Keeping plants alive and keeping them productive are quite different. 20 degrees is barely alive for some of our toughest fall plants. Floating row covers are very lightweight material that literally floats over the crops and traps a few degrees of heat while allowing sunlight and moisture to enter. Row covers provide some limited frost protection, as well as preventing damaging insects from getting to covered crops. Doubling up the fabric can increase the soil temperature even more and improve your overall productivity. Of course, it also increases the work of covering and uncovering crops. Heavy rains might press your plants down a bit and require some straightening up when the rains cease. You can see in this big bed over here that a heavy rain could flatten some of those plants in the middle, and you have to pull that cover off, pull the rocks off that are in the corners of it, and straighten up those plants, and then go about putting that cover back on. Extending the season with low tunnels and hoop tents. Hoop tents and tunnels are usually constructed with row cover material such as ramie, which is a spun nylon material that's suspended above the plants with fiberglass or metal or bamboo or PVC piping or even wood framing. You can see again why the beds are easier than regular rows to cover. If you look at the one here on the left, you see there's the frame of the bed, and you can attach this plastic right to that frame. If you look at the one on the right, you don't have any kind of frame to attach that material to. That provides you with something to hold down your material. The picture on the left will need to be vented during summer weather. It's plastic, and that temperature, even on a cool day, if it's sunny, you can put a thermometer inside of that plastic tent and the temperature will get up to 120 degrees. So it definitely needs to be vented on sunny days. The picture on the right was taken from the Root Cause farm showing long rows of greens. Probably not what the average home gardener would need. That row is probably 30 or at least 30 or 40 feet long. So that's a lot of greens. Extending the season with high tunnel hoop houses. The advantage here is that you can walk upright into the high tunnel hoop house. If you notice on the slide, you see there's a full-length door here, just like you would have in a normal greenhouse. So you don't have to be bending and stooping like you would with the lower hoop houses. The downside is that they're quite expensive. Covered with 2 layers of 6 mil greenhouse grade polyethylene to both provide some level of insulation. They're quite expensive, but also this polyethylene, it has to be ventilated as seen in the picture by rolling the material up on the sides, which you can see right here. You could use this structure to start plants in the spring or fall, and you could use it to carry plants through much of the winter, unless it's really a severe winter. I believe the last reference at the end of the slides and in the material that should have been sent to you has information on this particular hoop house. Again, this is not something that most gardens would need or could afford. What's the biggest issue with using floating row covers and hoops?
So we're getting overheating, irrigation, water access, ventilation.
And all of those are possible problems with this, especially if you're using the plastic covers. But the biggest problem of all with hoop houses and row covers, I think, is wind. I don't use row covers very often in my own garden because I get enough wind where I live to send my row covers into the next county. Well, maybe not the next county, maybe at least into my neighbor's yard or the neighbor's yard. It's just too windy. Now, this particular picture, if you look, you see you've got trees on at least 2 sides, and you can see the shadows in the bottom right corner here of trees. So in this situation where you have relatively good cover around your hoop tents or your mini greenhouses, this probably works well. You just have to try that out on your own property and see how windy it gets out there and how much you want to go spend time retrieving your row covers.
Alan?
Yes.
We have a couple of questions. Do we need hoop covers for a fall and winter garden, or can we just plant some vegetables without them?
There are a few plants that will probably make it through the winter if they're at maturity when we get our first significant frost. Things like kale and collards can be grown without cover, and we'll get it later on too. We'll be talking about garlic, and garlic you don't have to have any cover for, but most of your other crops that you would want to extend into the fall, you're going to need some kind of protection, whether it's just the floating row cover or some kind of hoops or other things that we'll talk about a little bit later on.
Okay, thank you.
Here's something that probably won't blow away on you: cold frames. Cold frames are like greenhouses, only they're very close to the ground and often in the ground. They're usually made of partially buried wood, brick, or block framing with the cover of glass or clear plastic. And they're used to grow plants for spring and fall applications. And if there's enough depth in the cold frame, you can carry crops through a good part of the winter. I'll show you a couple other slides on that in a minute. The glass or clear plastic serves as a frost barrier, especially when used with thermal collectors. The obvious benefit of cold frames is that they have greater insulation than row covers or hoops. Since they're partially buried, you have the soil around part of your cold frame, and the cold frame itself is usually, as shown here, is made of, this is 2x10 material, I believe. So you have much more insulation in that piece of wood than you would in just bare glass or bare plastic. And they're reasonably affordable. Now, one hint for practicality: don't make them too wide or you'll have a difficult time planting and harvesting them, because the lid prevents access from one side. If you can imagine back here on this back side, this lid is hinged, so it will open up, but that whole back side, you won't have any access to your plants for either putting plants in or harvesting them or watering them or whatever. You could only work with the two sides and the front. 3 feet is about all you can manage unless you're a long arm basketball player. And that's from my experience, because I've got quite a bit with this particular cold frame. Like hoop houses, they must be vented during sunny weather. Unless it's unusually hot, a couple of bricks placed under the frame below the glass will do nicely. You can see here, the picture is the cold frame is open on this one, and it has a fair amount of vegetables in it. I think this is late season. This is probably in March. The frame is open. You can see I've got a couple of bricks down here on this end and a couple of 2x4s up here on this end, pieces of 2x4s. You can close the lid with those bricks on there and you'll have an adequate amount of space for venting unless it's unusually hot. More advantages of using the raised bed for fall gardening are that they offer more consolidated areas to protect plants from frost. They provide a framework to attach covers for frost protection, and they provide some external insulation for crops and allow for growing more crops in the same space. The fact that you have a raised bed means you have a deeper bed of soil, and plant roots can grow deeper into this, so you can grow them a lot tighter than you could in an open row. This particular picture is from my garden, which is 5 miles west of Weaverville. You can see how the lid prevents access from that back side. You can't do anything back here in terms of access. I've showed you already the bricks down here. You could stack those diagonally right across the corner here, or 2x4s across this other corner, and then close the lid most of the way. Now, someone had asked me, well, what happens when you get high winds? Won't that blow the lid open? And I said, it's possible, but these lids are glass, so they're quite a bit heavier than just the plastic. But another thing you can do is you can attach a wire to the top of that lid, and when it's closed, you can wrap it around a screw placed in the front side of that frame, so that the lid, even with a strong wind, won't blow open on you. This is not the only way you can build a cold frame. Here's another example: straw bale cold frame, and this is at our learning garden here on Mount Carmel Road in Asheville. The thick straw walls provide a good deal of insulation for plants. Most of those straw bales are about 16 inches wide, so that gives you a lot of insulation. When you can get the straw for free from a light-a-home and use old shower doors that would otherwise just go to the dump, it becomes a very economical raised bed. The downside, because of the width of the bales, it's a hard bed to work, and I'll show you that in this next slide. Here you've got that same picture with one of those shower doors open to vent it. You can see you have to get to the bed, you've got to reach across bales anywhere you look. And like I say, those are about 16 inches wide. So again, you have to have pretty long arms to work this bed, or you actually have to get inside of it to work it. And when you want to vent it, since these doors are not hinged, you have to just open one of them up all the way. In this case, it's close to a shed, so we just lean the one door up against the shed.
Hey, Alan, we have a question.
Okay.
Does the cold frame need to face a particular direction or be oriented in a certain way?
Well, ideally for the winter, you would like to be able to orient a bed south by southwest, so you get that sun, which is at a lower angle in the fall and winter. But it depends on your property. You may not have that possibility in terms of locating the bed. For example, in my garden is basically facing maybe northwest at best, but that's the only place I could reasonably put in a decent sized garden. So it depends on what kind of access you have to a place that has a south and west facing landscape. Otherwise, you do the best you can.
Okay, and when do you need to start using a cold frame? At first frost?
Well, ideally, you have plants in there quite a bit before that first frost that are growing in this bed. Once you're coming up on that first frost, you're going to need to keep it covered. But you've got to get plants in there earlier, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later in this presentation.
Okay, thank you.
We're now moving on to the third topic, which is when to plant. We have a seed packet shown here, and this is a pretty good seed company. They provide more information than some other seed companies will. There's a lot of useful information on it. It tells you how long till germination and how long until harvest. You see the red line down here, it says days to harvest, 40. Find the right time and the right temperature and how many days until the plant reaches maturity. Days germination is 3 to 15 days, and days to harvest is 40. So if you figure a medium time, say 7 or 8 days to germination, and add that to days to harvest, you're up to about 47 days. You would like your plants to be at or close to maturity by the time you get this first frost. And the average in Buncombe County is October 25th. When I first moved here about 40 years ago, the average frost date was October 15th. So the planet is definitely warming up. Maybe at some time in the future, we won't even have to worry about the distinction between summer and fall gardening, but we do for right now. If for planting purposes, if you start with this date, October 25th, and you want to have plants near or close to maturity by the time you get that first frost, you have to count back. We're saying 40 days to harvest plus about half of that seed time, or 7 or 8 days. 47 days, if you take 30 off of it, you're back to September 25th, and another 15 days, you're back to about the 10th of September to get this crop in the ground. That's one piece of information, and I can't tell you how you have to be prepared for fall gardening. You have to make that preparation during the summer because you've got to get those plants in the ground. Key message for fall gardening is to be ready for a quick turnaround on growing crops. Plants will grow slower as the weather cools, so they need to be mature or close to it by that first frost, unless they're very cold hardy. Here's the second slide that talks about this issue of when to plant. And this one, it's pretty complicated, but it's got a lot of great information on it. There are 3 different colors on here, and the purple color is for us here in Western North Carolina. The second column gives you the days to harvest from seed unless otherwise shown. If you get down further where you have T's and S's, the T is for transplant and the S is for seed. This is also a reference that you should have with your material in terms of handouts. Gives you a lot of good information. The guide is from one that I would print and have available for spring, summer, and fall gardening. This guide indicates whether you should use transplants or seeds for all vegetables. And remember this color purple. Here you can see most of the fall crops that are shown on this page, which would be the beets, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and Chinese cabbage and carrots. All of those, if you look here for the July and August timeframe, they need to be in the ground at least by the end of August, almost all of them, if you're going to have harvest in October, November, or even later. So this is a good one, is to study it and figure out what you want to put in and when you have to get it started. Planting seeds. For fall planting usually means planting a little bit deeper because of lower soil temperature and lower moisture. If it says 3 times the diameter of the seed, you might want to go 4 times the diameter of the seed and put just a little bit more cover on the small seeds that are covered lightly. And probably the most important is keeping that soil moist. You will be planting in some of the hottest weather in August and early September, and that soil dries out very quickly in the top inch or so where you're going to have most of your seed. When I'm planting seeds for fall, it's not unusual for me not only to water those seeds every day, but if it's a really hot day, to even water twice. Water in the morning and water again in late afternoon. They're seeds, so you don't have to worry about the issue of diseases on plants. You don't have any plants yet. You're just trying to get them going. Now, planting transplants. There's a sense of urgency to fall gardening that doesn't exist in the spring and summer garden. Early in the year, you have all the time you want to get those plants in the ground and growing. But in the fall, because temperatures are cooling off and sun angle is lowering and the hours of sunlight are decreasing, you just don't have as much time to play with. So there is a sense of urgency. And the idea of using transplants over seeds is that the transplants are a few to several weeks ahead of seeds. If you study that calendar chart, you'll see there's a big difference between how long it takes to get a plant to maturity when it comes in as a transplant versus a seed. Keep that in mind, and I would highly recommend transplants whenever you can legitimately do that. And you can water it in with a fertilizer. Liquid fertilizer is best, just as you're putting that transplant in the ground. Put some liquid fertilizer on it, and that will help speed it up a little bit. Seeds versus transplants, and my recommendation, when you can, go ahead and use transplants. So now we're moving on to our 4th topic, and that's what to plant. Now here's the list of fall garden vegetables. It's certainly not an all-inclusive list, but includes a lot of the major vegetables that would typically be grown in the fall. I'll ask the question now, what one characteristic identifies all the fall garden plants that are showing here with one exception? And I'm not really going to ask for you to answer this on chat. I'll just answer it for you. But if you look at this list, everything on the list, with the exception of peas, do not require pollination. Most of the fall garden vegetables, you're eating the leaves, you're eating the stalk, or you're eating the roots. And none of those require pollination. The one item listed here, peas, would require pollination. If you're going to grow peas and you're going to have them under a floating row cover or in a hoop tent, you're going to have to open that tent up at least for a couple hours a day to allow for pollination. So once you have flowers on peas or any other fall crop that requires pollination, you're going to have them uncovered for a period of time so they can be pollinated. Anything else on this list, you don't have to worry about that. And that's one of the reasons that fall gardening works so well with covering the crops, because you don't have to worry about pollination. Going into a little more depth on plants for the fall, greens, and these are hardy greens, kale, spinach, collards, chard, and cabbage. Most of these plants are quite cold hardy, especially the collards and kale. In fact, I said earlier, collards and kale, if they're mature by the time you get that first frost, they will probably make it through the winter. Obviously, production will slow down the colder the temperature gets, but they will survive. And you'll see a picture later of kale that's uncovered from snow and looks just fine.
Alan?
Yes.
There's a question about the cold frame again regarding the height of some of those plants in that earlier slide you mentioned that would get taller than the height of the cold frame. How do you deal with that?
Well, the way I've dealt with it is year after year, I've added another 2x4 frame to the cold frame to raise it up so that you have more depth. Even then, with adding as much as an additional 8 inches, you could do 2x4 frame, or you could do 2x8 frame on top of the existing one and raise your lid up. There will be some plants that will get kind of pressed down when that lid is closed, and you may get some frost burn on those upper leaves. That's the limitation of cold frames. The next thing you would have to go to would be some kind of hoop covering. And I said in my particular case, that's not really much of an option because the amount of wind I get. But you can build that as high, those cold frames as high as you want. The only limitation is it makes it a little bit harder to work the plants inside.
Okay, thank you.
Salad greens are considered semi-hardy. That is, they will survive cold weather if they have some cover. They're not going to take as much cold weather as the greens I showed you just a second ago, especially the kale and the collards. Some that are recommended in our area, head lettuce, romaine, and butterhead are two. And I grow Freckles lettuce, which is in the romaine family, but it's kind of a looser head than a regular romaine. Loose leaf lettuce, arugula, and mesclun mix. And note the spelling here on mesclun. It's not mescaline, it's mesclun. Mescaline is a hallucinogenic drug, and I don't think you want that in your garden. Those are some of the semi-hardy salad greens, and there are many, many more. All different kinds of lettuce, and the mesclun mixes are just phenomenal. They usually mix cabbage type crops with some kind of lettuce, but you can get pure cabbage or you can get pure lettuce mixes too in the mesclun. Here's that picture of kale. It's uncovered. You pull the snow back and you look at that kale, and it's just as fresh and tender as the kale here on the right. And I have to say, it's been uncovered from snow. And the same thing will happen with collards too. You can grow those, even though they got snow on top of them, you can pull that back and you can harvest quite edible collards or quite edible kale. They're very winter hardy. These plants you can grow from seed if the seed is in the ground August into early September. You want to get those plants again by October 25th. They need to be mature or close to mature when we're looking at the first frost. Broccoli, you can grow that in the spring or fall. It produces a central head like this, and then it will produce side shoots, especially if you once you cut that central head off. That side shoots will show up where the leaf stems meet the trunk of the plant here. You'll get small shoots. They won't be those nice big heads the size of a softball. Will be much smaller, but they're certainly edible. These you want to grow from transplants that are put in the ground in July and August. Cauliflower, the educated cabbage. Mark Twain said cauliflower is nothing but cabbage with a college education. And I just picked up that term. I liked it. And so you're seeing it here, something that takes one of our great American authors and relates them to fall gardening. Again, you can grow cauliflower from transplants that are planted in July and August. If you're going to do it from seed, you're going to have to start much, much earlier. Now we have a few slides on root vegetables. With beets, you can use them for greens or obviously eat the beet root. You can see here that they're no longer just red. They have these beautiful ones with red and white centers. There's also, I believe, a yellow beet and one that is a cream colored, almost white, and probably other colors. Again, you can seed those in July and August, and you want to thin them to 2 to 4 inches apart. You don't have to throw those individual plants that you pull up to thin out. You don't have to throw those away. You can wash them off and add them to your salad. If you buy greens in these little plastic tubs, if you see the greens have red veins in them, that's probably beet tops. All right, carrots. With carrots, like the turnips, you want to use the short varieties. And again, it's just a question of time. A 4-inch carrot's going to mature a lot quicker than a 10 or 12-inch carrot. You want to thin them to 1 to 3 inches apart, and you can seed those carrot seeds in July and September. And one of the things I wanted to say about that in terms of seeding carrots, when they first come out of the ground, when they first sprout, they're kind of hard to see. And especially if you're working in raised beds where your planting is pretty tight. One of the secrets I learned from an old gardener here in North Carolina is that when he's planting carrots, about every 6 to 12 inches, he'll put 1 or 2 reddish seeds in that same row. And the reason for that is that the reddish seeds will germinate a lot quicker than the carrots, and the reddish plant will grow to maturity a lot quicker than the carrots. As those reddish seeds are growing up, that identifies where your row is. By the time you harvest the radishes, you clearly have some carrot tops to work with. One more thing on carrots, we had some recommendations for types of carrots. The Danver half long, which is shown in this picture, Thumbelina, Amsterdam, and Chantney are all some of the smaller ones that you probably want to grow in the fall. Another fall vegetable, root crop, turnips. They're not near as popular today as they were when I was growing up. Almost everybody had turnips in a fall garden back then. And again, you can grow them for the greens or the roots. Now, the greens on turnips are kind of fuzzy. I don't think you'd want to just put those into a salad. Some people might, but most people probably wouldn't. But you could blanch them, cook them lightly, and serve them as a green. For turnips, you want to use the small turnips, the ones that are maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches in diameter when they're mature. And again, the reason for that is simply that we're talking about how much time do you want to spend getting these plants in the ground before that frost. And the smaller the bulb, the quicker it's going to grow. So you don't have to go back as far in time as you would if you wanted a turnip with a 6-inch bulb on it. Again, you can grow them from seed that's put in July all the way into early September. Swiss chard. Swiss chard is more heat tolerant. You can grow it all summer long, but it's less cold hardy. I grow Swiss chard in the winter. In fact, this picture on the left, now this is not taken in the winter, this is taken in about late April, early May. It's grown well beyond my cold frame. You see the cold frame on the bottom, and that Swiss chard is now about 4.5 feet tall. I think Swiss chard is certainly the prettiest fall vegetable, maybe the prettiest vegetable, period. If you look at all of the colors on the picture on the left, it's what's called rainbow chard. And it comes in all of these different colors, from dark purple to pink with stripes in it, purple leaves, dark green leaves, even red. So there's a lot of color there. And again, you can grow that from seed that's in the ground from August 1 through about the 15th of September. Okay, another root crop, onions, bunching or shallots. So simple to grow. Plant from bulbs or sets. These varieties that are shown here, Ebenezer, Yellow Globe, Silver Skin, and Danvers, are recommended by Extension horticulture specialist Doug Sanders in one of his blogs. Shallots grow quickly enough that you can harvest the green onions later in the fall, and if protected, they will keep on well into early spring. The green, if you let them go that long into early spring, the green tops might get a little sketchy, but you'll have small onion bulbs, maybe up to 1.5 1.75 inches, that you can use just like any other onion bulb. The individual layers aren't quite as thick, but they're certainly edible. Garlic. Now here's one where you're going to plant it in the fall, but you're not going to harvest it in the fall. You plant in October or November. You break the bulbs apart into individual cloves. The clove is what you're going to plant, pointed end up, pointed end up. Plant 1 inch deep and 4 inches apart. Although garlic is quite hardy, it's a good idea to mulch it with straw or chopped leaves or grass clippings. The mulch will provide extra protection in the winter, but it will also prevent the garlic roots from being heaved out of the ground by alternate freezing and thawing. And then you will harvest in the spring or summer. The garlic will start growing again in the spring, and it will produce leaves or stalks and scapes. Scapes don't grow on all garlic, but some varieties of garlic will get these things on the top of the greens. They're kind of curly cues at the top. You want to cut these off or just break them over to get larger garlic bulbs. By breaking them over or cutting them off, it assures that all of the food the plant produces will go into the garlic bulb itself and not into that green top or those scapes, although some people consider scapes a delicacy. Harvest the garlic when the leaves, stalks turn yellow-brown during the summer. Garlic is best planted from cloves obtained from garden centers or mail order catalogs. And the reason for that is that if you use garlic that you bought in a grocery store, it might have been sprayed with a growth retardant that prevents the plant from putting out green shoots. The two types of garlic, hardneck varieties, and some that are recommended for this area, German extra hardy, chestnut, red, music, Spanish roja, and the soft necks, the other major variety. And the big difference between the two, hardnecks have a stalk, that hence the hard neck, that stems up from the center of the bulb and turns rigid as it matures. Soft necks don't really have a stalk. They have leaves that are in kind of a sheath that opens up at the top. So you have these long blades rather than a single stalk. Soft neck leaves remain soft and flexible at maturity. Hardneck varieties grow one ring of cloves around the stem, where soft neck varieties have layers of cloves around that stem. Some people believe that the hardneck variety has more flavor, and some folks also say hardneck is easier to peel. The garlic that you would typically find in the grocery store are mainly softneck varieties. And the reason for that is that softneck garlic tends to keep longer than hardneck. And the varieties that are shown here were recommended by North Carolina Extension horticultural specialist Janine Davis. So those are some that you might want to try if you're going to grow garlic.
Alan,
Yes.
we have a question from somebody that lives at 4,300 feet elevation and wondering if they should plant their hardneck garlic deeper than an inch.
We didn't talk really about microclimates, and we've got lots of them in Buncombe County, but what conditions you find at 2,300 feet versus 4,300 feet are significant. When they say that our average first frost is October 25th, I'm sure it's probably earlier than that at 4,300 feet. I think you could plant it a little bit deeper. You can also mulch it to help prevent any frost damage to it.
Thank you.
We're now about ready to move into the fifth and final portion of the talk, and that is on cover crops. Cover crops. There's some information about them. If you don't want a fall garden or you're just tired of gardening, you might want to try a cover crop. Cover crops are plants that are planted to cover the soil rather than for the purpose of being harvested. Cover crops reduce soil erosion, improve soil quality, and certainly decrease weeds. They increase biomass in the soil, and if they're a leguminous variety, which fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere and makes this important element available to plants, you get that additional benefit from the cover crop. Many of the cover crops will make our pollinators happy too by producing lots of flowers, especially things like buckwheat and Facilia. In addition to everything else, they're good for our pollinators. Here are some of the legume types of cover crops that are good for fall gardens. Austrian winter peas, the one pictured here in the right, upper right, and the crimson clover is shown down below. The legumes, as I said, can gather nitrogen from the air and fix it in their root nodules in the soil. Austrian winter peas, which is shown in the upper right, they are an excellent cover crop for not just the fall, but all the way through to the following spring. The Austrian peas will die back a little bit when you get some really cold weather, but they seem to just come back from that as soon as it warms up a little bit. One of the other advantages of Austrian winter peas is that you can eat the pea tendrils. You won't have any flowers on them, but you'll have leaves and these stems. You can go out to your garden and just simply cut some of them off of your cover crop. Don't use all of it or you won't have a cover crop, but some of them. And you can actually make a pretty good salad using pea tendrils as your main ingredient. Crimson clover is one shown on the bottom, and two others, vetch, and where I say clover here as the fourth one, that's like white Dutch clover. All of those are legumes, and all of them provide good winter cover for your soil. We've got additional fall cover crops, and most of these are used by farmers. Not quite as much for home gardening, but you could use them. Annual ryegrass and oats, winter wheat, and winter rye. A lot of farmers will have these in the ground for a period of time and then kill the grass and use it as mulch, or they'll disc it into their soil to improve the soil. The one that's shown here, this stuff that is all a tan color out here, that's the oats. But any of those four, annual ryegrass, oats, winter wheat, winter rye. Now, I also list buckwheat on this slide. Buckwheat is not a grass, and buckwheat is not wheat. But it does make a good cover crop, but not a winter cover crop. It's a cover crop that you would use in spring and summer if you've got a bed that you're not using at that time and you want to add some nutrition to it. Buckwheat will be killed with halfway decent frost in fall. So you can grow it up until that time. Buckwheat is also a really good pollinator attractant. Now, something that we've been using in the learning garden out here on Mount Carmel Road in Asheville for the last few years is Facilia. Facilia is a bioaccumulator. Bioaccumulator means that this plant harvests soil nutrients that can then be shared with other crops by either turning the Facilia under or allowing it to break down when it's cut and used as a mulch. The picture on the left is Facilia in full bloom. It's also a real attractor for pollinators, especially bees and especially bumblebees. The picture on the right is just a blow up so you get a better idea of what the flower actually looks like. One caution with Facilia, some people when they're handling this plant, like if they're cutting it down to use for mulch or something, will get a mild skin reaction from it. The skin will just get red spots that last a couple of days. I only know of one person who works in our vegetable garden here at the Learning Center that had that reaction, but apparently it is something that can bother some people. And I would say if you're working with it, you might want to put on a pair of nitrile gloves if you're cutting it down, just to protect yourself.
Alan?
Yes.
Somebody wanted to know about, do raised beds need cover crops?
They don't absolutely need them. Cover crops are good for any soil, whether you're talking about row crops or raised beds. It simply provides some additional nutrition to that bed, and also it protects the bed.
Somebody asked, what type of Facilia are you talking about?
This particular one is called lacy Facilia, but if you go online and you look for Facilia, this is what you will typically get. It's not used that much in home gardens here. Out in the Midwest and all the way up into Canada, commercial farmers use it a lot. There are Facilia fields that can run for miles. Nature abhors a vacuum. If you do not cover your soil, weeds will blow in, or those already there will germinate in the open soil. Additionally, soil microbes in the top few inches of soil will die or at least cease their activity in winter. So another option for covering your beds for winter are shredded leaves. Shredded leaves are an excellent cover for your garden throughout the winter. The leaves will protect the soil and gradually break down. In the spring, you can turn them into the soil, or if there are too many of them, you might just rake them off and add them to your compost pile. Shredded leaves can be used as a mulch for vegetables. When you're growing your plants and you have plants, not seedlings, but plants, you can use the shredded leaves as a mulch around them. The picture on the right here is just showing people have extra shredded leaves that they didn't use for covering plants. And so they've got them sitting there and they can use those with the compost. You know, when you're talking compost, you mix green and browns. The brown is your carbon, and your leaves here are an excellent source of that carbon. Takeaways. Here's what I would suggest as 3 takeaways from this little talk. Fall gardens require planning for success. You can't wait until the fall to start planning a fall garden. If you look at the timelines for getting vegetables in the ground for fall, you've got to count back quite a ways. So most of your planting is occurring in mid to late summer. There's this sense of urgency in fall gardening. You don't have all the time in the world. The conditions are not improving, they are declining. Sunlight is declining, hours of sunlight is declining, and the temperature is declining. And finally, you have to have frost protection for most of the things you plant. Not everything, but most of them. If you want to grow plants beyond that first significant frost, you have to have some frost protection. Enjoy growing a fall vegetable, and I hope you've learned something new about gardening. And I wish you all success, and thanks for listening. And now I guess we can take some questions.
When do you plant white clover?
You can plant white clover spring, summer, and fall. You have to keep it fairly moist to get it going. I started some in early spring this year, and I didn't water it enough, and it's kind of sketchy, so I'm going to have to reseed that. The big thing is it doesn't have to hardly be buried at all. It's very fine seed. You kind of put the seed down and put very little covering over it, except that you might want to put some straw on top of it just to hold the moisture in that soil. But when you put straw in it, don't put a whole heavy batch of straw. Don't put it on real thick. You should be able to look at that straw and still see patches of ground beneath it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Somebody had put in a note about adding mustard greens to the cover crop mix. And I'd like to answer that one, just to say that that's certainly fine to use greens as a cover crop. It doesn't fix the soil. What it can do is work as a biofumigant if you have soil-borne diseases. Some commercial growers will use it for soil-borne diseases and nematodes. So that's on mustard greens. There was a question also, Alan, about cover crops going to seed and becoming weedy the next spring.
Whether you're growing fall cover crops or spring or summer cover crops, if you don't want them to reseed, you've got to take them out, either take them out or at least cut the tops off as soon as they begin to flower. And you're going to have to do that over a period of time because different plants will flower a few days ahead or behind something else. But yes, if you leave them there, you'll have your regular crop plus a cover crop at the same time, and you probably don't want to do that.
We want to thank everybody for joining us today for our program. Alan, would you like to say anything else before we sign off?
I would just say I put the slide up for the garden helpline. If you have other questions, it gives the times down there that helpline is available. And beyond that, I just say I wish you the best of luck with fall gardening. And this is the time to get going on it right now.